Today, we will talk about the GDP gap, which is the difference between the actual gross domestic product and the potential GDP of an economy. A GDP gap is the difference between the actual gross domestic product and the potential GDP of an economy as represented by the long-term trend. A negative GDP gap represents the forfeited output of a country's economy resulting from the failure to create sufficient jobs for all those willing to work. A large positive GDP gap, on the other hand, generally signifies that an economy is overheated and at risk of high inflation. The difference between real GDP and potential GDP is also known as the output gap. A GDP gap can be positive or negative and is calculated as the actual GDP minus the potential GDP, divided by the potential GDP. From a macroeconomic perspective, you want the smallest possible GDP gap, and preferably no gap at all. A negative gap shows that an economy is operating at less than its full potential, leaving money on the table from where it should be trend-wise. Negative GDP gaps are common after economic shocks or financial crises, reflecting a hesitant business environment and leading to less hiring and perhaps even continued layoffs in all sectors. On the other hand, a positive GDP gap may be a sign that the economy is overheated and heading toward a correction, posing a risk of high inflation. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the actual GDP in the United States for the fourth quarter of 2020 was $20.93 trillion. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis projected a potential GDP of $19.41 trillion. Running this through the formula, $20.93 to $19.41, $19.41, we get a positive GDP gap of about 0.8%, representing a moment in time. Policymakers keep an eye on the GDP gap and make adjustments to try and keep growth in line with the long-term trend. The term GDP gap also describes the difference in GDP between two national economies. In recent years, attention has been paid to the GDP gap between the United States and China. In 2020, this GDP gap was estimated to be around $5.9 trillion, representing a rapid closing in by China. China's huge infrastructure investments and quicker economic recovery from the 2020 crisis are contributing to its potential to overtake the U.S. economy in GDP terms. However, some economists argue that an aging population and growing debt pile could keep China confined to second place. Here are 4 key takeaways. 1. A GDP gap is represented as the difference between an economy's actual GDP and potential GDP. 2. Negative GDP gaps are common after economic shocks or financial crises and are reflective of an underperforming economy. 3. A large positive GDP gap may be a sign that the economy is overheated and poses an inflationary risk. 4. The term GDP gap also describes the difference in GDP between two national economies. Hope this would help. Thanks for watching.